In the former part of the last century, there lived a man of science. Proficient in all his areas of study, here he is. With knowledge abounding and hope for happiness, he left his laboratory to an assistant to wed a beautiful woman. In these days of the 1920s, wealth and prosperity seemed to open man's path into the region of miracle. The world could simply be bought. It was not uncommon for the love of money to rival the love of woman in its depth and absorbing energy. The higher intellect, the imagination, the spirit, and maybe even the heart itself might all find their congenial ailment in pursuits which would ascend from one step of power and influence to another until he could buy or create a new world for himself. Elemer possessed this degree of faith in man's ultimate control of fate. He had devoted himself, however, too unreservedly to scientific studies to ever be weaned from them by any secondary passion. His love for his wife might prove to be the stronger of the two, but it could only be by intertwining itself with his love of science and uniting them in a way that would acquire him the life he so desperately required. Elemer wed the fair Georgiana. The marriage was blissful, save for Georgiana's one blemish. Georgiana, though she possessed all things beautiful, also possessed a birthmark upon her cheek. Red against her marble-white skin, it brought out the deepest loathing in Elemer. In the eyes of her other suitors, it only heightened their affections, a quaint and lovable trait. In the eyes of Elemer, it was atrocious. It made aware to him that perfect things could fail, that everything is not always as it appears. It reminded him that flawlessness can be ruined by death and decay. So Elemer devised a plan to rid fair Georgiana of this birthmark that irked him so. He was creating his ideal and perfect creature, as though he had forgotten the very charm about Georgiana that he had once felt deeply in love with, seeing only her blemish instead of her.
Georgiana, has it never occurred to you that the mark upon your cheek might be removed? It creates a feeling in me of discomfort.
No, my dear. It's often been called a charm. I guess I was simple enough to believe it to be.
Ah, on another face it might be. But on a face so beautiful as yours, so becoming and promising, it shocks me.
Indeed, it gave Elemer chills, like something was out of place. He couldn't erase the birthmark from his mind. He was oft haunted by dreams in the night. He dreamt that he went to remove the birthmark, and it reached into the very heart of dear Georgiana. It had her heart in a vice grip. He couldn't remove the birthmark because Georgiana was made of the birthmark.
It's in her heart now. You must have it out!
He awoke in a panic, only to find Georgiana at his side, asking what ailed him in the night.
Do you remember, my dear Elmer?
Remember what?
Have you any recollection of a dream last night about this odious hand?
No!
Did you dream of it?
No!
I wonder that you can forget it. Is it possible to get this one expression?
Absurd!
It is in your heart now. We must have it out. Reflect, my husband, for by all means, I would have you recall that dream.
When the dream had shaped itself perfectly in his memory, Elemer sat in his wife's presence with a guilty feeling. Truth often finds its way to the mind close, muffled in robes of sleep, and then speaks with uncompromising directness and of matters in regard to which we practice an unconscious self-deception during our waking moments. Until now, he had not been aware of the tyrannizing influence acquired by one idea over his mind, and of the lengths which he might find in his heart to go for the sake of giving himself peace. Georgiana knew not what the cost might have been to both of them to rid her of the birthmark. She entertained the thought that it might go as deep as life itself. All she knew is that she somehow had to detach from that hand that had clasped her cheek before she had come to this earth. He had spent much thought on the subject of removal. He was convinced of the perfect practicality of its removal. Georgiana had led him deeper than ever into the heart of his science. He felt he was fully competent and ready to render the dear cheek as faultless as its fellow. Ah, what his triumph would have been when he created what was the scorn on perfection. He placed her here.
Throw open the door to the boudoir, Aminadab, and burn a pestle.
Yes, master. If she were my wife, I would never part with that birthmark.
In this quaint little room, surrounded by fragrance and everything wonderful, save for the sunlight. She awoke and knew not where she was, until she saw Alima sitting across from her, staring intently as she came back to the world of consciousness. In order to soothe Georgiana, and as it were, to release her mind from the burden of actual things, Alima now put in practice some of the light and playful secrets which science had taught him among its profounder lore. Alima bade her cast her eyes upon a vessel containing a quantity of earth. She did so, with little interest at first, but was soon startled to perceive the germ of a plant shooting upward from the soil. Then came the slender stalk. The leaves gradually unfolded themselves, and amid them was a perfect and lovely flower. To make up for this abortive experiment, he proposed another experiment, to take her portrait by a scientific process of his own invention. It was to be effected by rays of light striking upon a polished plate of metal. Georgiana assented, but on looking at the result, was affrighted to find the features of the portrait blurred and indefinable, while the minute figure of a hand appeared where the cheek should have been. Alima snatched the metal plate and threw it into a jar of corrosive acid. Soon, however, he forgot these mortifying failures. In the intervals of study and chemical experiment, he came to her flushed and exhausted, but seemed invigorated by her presence, and spoke in gloomy language of the resources of his art. To dispel the tedium of hours, Georgiana turned over the volume of his library. In many dark old tomes, she met with chapters full of romance, poetry, and stunning imaginary. There were the works of authors and poets of the current day, such as Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot. All these writers seemed to send in her a chime. It highlighted a resonating emptiness that she could not help but feeling. It seemed to be flowing through her in one central point in her cheek. Spiraling around her, she felt it to her very core. But to Georgiana, the most engrossing volume was a large folio from her husband's own hand, in which he had recorded every experiment of his scientific career, its original aim, the methods adapted for its development, and its final success or failure, with the circumstances to which either event was attributable. Much as he had accomplished, she could not but observe what his most splendid successes were almost invariably failures. If compared with the ideal at which he aimed, his brightest diamonds were the merest pebbles, and felt to be so by himself, in comparison with the inestimable gems which lay hidden beyond his reach. The volume, rich with achievements that had won renown for its author, was yet as melancholy a record as ever mortal hand has penned. It was the sad confession and continual exemplification of the shortcomings of man and the despair that corresponds. Perhaps every man of genius, in whatever sphere, might recognize the image of his own experiment and experience in Elima's journal. The concoction for removal had been drafted perfectly. I was assured of it. Georgiano was overrejoiced at the thought of fixing this one blemish that had caused Elima and herself so much worry and distress. She was fit for heaven, with no thought of death, even though Elima was sure that the draught would not fail. Georgiana begged for the goblet of golden liquid, and joyfully stalked upon his work.
It is grateful. Methinks it is like water from a heavenly fountain, for it contains I know not what of unobtrusive fragrance and deliciousness. It fills a feverish emptiness that has left me parched for many days. Now, dearest, as I sleep, my earthly senses are closing over my spirit.
By heaven, it's nigh well gone. I can scarcely trace it now. Success! Success! And now it is like the faintest rose color. The lightest flush of blood across her cheek would overcome it. But she is so pale. It worked! My God, it worked! It worked!
Yeah! My poor Almer.
Poor, nay, richest, happiest, most favored. My peerless bride, it is successful. You are perfect.
My poor Almer. You have aimed loftily. You have done nobly. Do not repent that with so high and pure feeling, you have rejected the best the earth could offer. Almer, dearest Almer, I am dying.
Alas, it was too true. The defect griped her very soul. Elima looked for a sign of a divine spirit being held to the mortal world by that faint and rosy hand, but he was greeted with emptiness. Seemingly perfect, Georgiana was gone. No ceremony, no pomp. He had killed her for her flaw. Nay, I killed her. I am he, and through this I reached a profounder wisdom. I need not thus have flung away happiness I felt for a short time. The momentary circumstance was too strong. I failed to look beyond the shadowy scopes of the times. I failed to note the warning I had had that the blemish reached all the way to Georgiana's core. So I will live once for all eternity and find the only future left in the present.
Go some more. Be an airplane.